The first time I heard it, I was with 6 other people. That matters. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to understand why I didn't just leave, why none of us did, because it wasn't a private experience. It wasn't something I can fold into the category of exhaustion or grief or the particular kind of auditory pareidolia that loneliness produces. 6 other people heard it with me, and we all looked at each other, and nobody said the obvious thing, and I think that collective silence is where the actual horror began. I need to talk about the job first. I was 27 and working for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources as a seasonal field technician. The position was lake monitoring dissolved oxygen levels, temperature profiles, ice thickness measurements, fish population assessments beneath winter cover. It sounds clinical when I describe it like that. In practice, it meant driving alone to frozen lakes before dawn, augering holes through 2 feet of ice, lowering sensors into black water, and recording numbers in a waterproof notebook while your fingers stopped working one by one. The pay was $31,000 a year, no benefits until your 3rd consecutive season. I was in my 2nd. The team was small. There were 12 of us covering a territory that spanned from Mille Lacs down to the Iowa border, but mostly we worked alone. You'd see each other at the district office in Mankato maybe twice a month for equipment maintenance or data uploads. The rest of the time it was you, your truck, frozen access roads, and a landscape so flat and white it felt like sensory deprivation with a wind chill. I didn't mind it. That's important to say, honestly. I didn't mind the solitude. After the divorce, and I'll say it plainly, I was the one who ruined it. I was the one who drank through year 2 of the marriage until she couldn't stand the shape of me anymore after that. The quiet felt appropriate, like penance that also paid rent. I had a studio apartment in North Mankato with a mattress on the floor and a coffee maker and nothing on the walls, and the frozen lakes were just an extension of that blankness. I fit inside the work the way you fit inside a coat that's slightly too large. Room to disappear in. January of that year was brutal. Not unusual brutal Minnesota brutal, which is its own category. Sustained lows of -20, wind chills approaching -50, the kind of cold that makes your truck tires go square overnight and your nostrils seal shut with every inhale. The lakes were locked solid. Ice thickness readings were coming back at 26, 28 inches. Some of the shallower bodies were freezing nearly to the bottom, which meant potential winter kill fish suffocating under the ice as dissolved oxygen dropped to 0. That was our primary concern that month. Winter kill assessment. Lake Kasota was on my rotation. It's a small lake, maybe 300 acres, shallow, weedy in summer, popular with panfish anglers. Sits about 4 miles south of town in a flat agricultural basin. No houses on it, no cabins. One public access point on the north shore that the county plowed intermittently. The kind of lake that doesn't appear on tourism maps because there's nothing remarkable about it. I'd been taking readings there every 2 weeks since November. Normal numbers, normal ice, normal silence. On January 14th, I drove out before dawn as usual. The access road was drifted over from the last storm, but my truck handled it. I parked at the landing, geared up, pulled the auger and my monitoring kit onto the sled, and walked out. The sky was that pre-dawn violet that happens when it's extremely cold and very clear, no clouds to trap whatever residual warmth existed, just radiation bleeding straight into space. The ice was bare in most places, scoured by wind. My boots made that hollow knocking sound that thick ice produces when it's clear and dense. I set up at my usual station, about 200 yards offshore, marked with a GPS waypoint from previous visits. Augured the hole, lowered the YSI probe, waited for the readings to stabilize. Dissolved oxygen at 3.2 milligrams per liter, which was low. Temperature profile showing near uniform 4 degrees Celsius below the thermocline. I noted it all down, pulled the probe, moved to my second station, further out toward the center. I was auguring the second hole when the ice cracked. Not under me, I don't mean structural failure. I mean the lake made that sound. That long, resonant, almost musical boom that large ice sheets produce as they expand and contract with temperature changes. If you've spent any time on frozen lakes, you know the sound. It travels for miles. It starts as a sharp report somewhere distant and then stretches into this descending tone, like someone running a mallet across an enormous metal plate. It's physics. It's thermal stress. It's normal. But what came after it was not normal. In the silence following that crack, in that specific held breath moment after the boom dissipated, I heard laughter, children laughing, muffled but distinct, directional, coming from below me, from beneath the ice. I stopped auguring. I stood completely still. My hands were on the handle of the auger, which was still seated in the half-finished hole, and I didn't move them. I didn't breathe. I listened. Nothing. Wind. The faint tick of my truck's cooling engine from the shore. My own pulse in my ears. I waited maybe 2 full minutes, standing motionless in negative 18-degree air, and heard nothing else. I finished my readings. I drove back. I did not mention it to anyone. I wrote it off as ice acoustics. There are documented cases of ice producing sounds that mimic voices, especially in large sheets under extreme thermal stress. Frequency harmonics can align in ways that the human brain, desperate for pattern, interprets as speech or laughter. I knew this. I'd read about it in training materials. I filed it away and moved on. 2 weeks later, January 28th, I returned for my next scheduled readings. Same routine, same pre-dawn approach. This time, the access road was better. We'd had a brief warming trend to about -5, which in context felt almost tropical. The ice was holding steady at 27 inches. Dissolved oxygen had dropped to 2.1 milligrams per liter at my first station, which meant winterkill was becoming likely. I noted it, flagged it for follow-up. At my second station, center of the lake, I augured through and lowered the probe. While I was waiting for readings to stabilize, I crouched down near the hole and looked into the water out of habit. The water was dark black with a faint brownish tint from tannins. Visibility maybe 8 inches at best. Nothing unusual. But while I was crouched there, face close to the hole, I heard it again. Laughter, children, multiple voices. Muffled the way sound is muffled when it travels through a medium denser than air. Not distant immediate, present, directly below the ice beneath my knees. This time, I didn't freeze. I pressed my ear to the ice surface beside the hole. The ice was so cold it burned my skin, but I held there listening. And I heard it clearly. A babble of small voices. Not screaming, not distressed. Playing. The formless, overlapping, breathless laughter of children at play, rising and falling in that irregular rhythm that real laughter has not mechanical, not looped, but organic and responsive, as if multiple children were reacting to each other. I pulled my head up. I looked across the lake in every direction. The landscape was empty. Flat white ice meeting flat white fields, meeting pale gray sky. No houses within a mile. No roads close enough to carry sound. No one else on the lake. It was 6:45 in the morning and -12 degrees. There were no children anywhere. I packed my equipment quickly. I didn't run, but I moved with a deliberateness that I recognized even then as controlled fear. On the drive back, my hands shook on the steering wheel, and I told myself it was the cold. I need to describe what happened next carefully, because this is where I made the choice that I think about every day. I didn't report it, I didn't tell my supervisor, I didn't log it in my field notes. What I did instead was call Dana Okereke, who worked the lakes north of me, and ask if she'd ever heard anything unusual on the ice. I kept it casual, just a question between colleagues. Dana said, "Like the booming?" I said, "No, beyond that, like sounds that seemed almost like voices." There was a pause. Then she said, "You're on Kasota, right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Talk to Ellickson." Paul Ellickson was the senior technician for our district. He'd been with the DNR for 19 years. He was the one who trained me on ice augering technique, probe calibration, all of it. Quiet man. Efficient. The kind of person who never says more than a sentence when a sentence will do. I'd always respected him. I called Ellickson that evening. When I told him what I'd heard, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How close were you to center?" I said I was at my second station, approximately center of the lake. He said, "We need to go out there together. I'll bring a full team." I asked why. He said, "Because it's not just you, and it's not new." That conversation was on a Wednesday. Ellickson scheduled the group visit for Saturday, February 1st. He asked me not to talk about it with anyone else on the team until then. I agreed, though I didn't understand why. Those 3 days of waiting were difficult. Not because I was afraid, exactly, but because the agreement to not speak about it made it feel illicit. Like I'd been recruited into something. On Saturday morning, I drove to Kasota in the dark and found 5 other trucks already at the access point. Ellickson was there. Dana was there. 3 others I knew less well. Marcus Webb, Terry Aldridge, and a woman named Josie Fenn, who worked the southeast quadrant. Everyone was dressed for extended ice time. Ellickson had a sled loaded with equipment I didn't recognize what looked like hydrophones, a portable amplifier, a device I later learned was a geophone typically used for seismic monitoring. Nobody spoke much. The mood was not excitement. It was the focused, slightly grim energy of people preparing for something they'd rather not do but have agreed is necessary, like an intervention. We walked out onto the ice together in the gray pre-dawn, pulling the sleds, boots knocking hollow on the bare surface. Ellickson navigated by GPS to a point very close to my second station. He stopped and said, "Here." Then he said, "Everyone spread out, 10-foot spacing. Sit on the ice, be still, be quiet." We arranged ourselves in a rough circle, maybe 60 feet in diameter. I sat on my foam pad and pulled my knees up. The cold immediately began seeping through my insulated pants. The sky was lightening to that pale dishwater color of deep winter dawn. No wind, no sound except our breathing and the faint creaking of the ice. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. I could feel the others' discomfort not with the cold, which we were all accustomed to, but with the silence, the formality of it, the strangeness of sitting on a frozen lake in the dark, waiting for something that Ellickson clearly expected but hadn't named. At approximately 7:12, I checked my watch compulsively, needing the anchor of specificity. The ice boomed. That familiar thermal crack, far off to the south, traveling beneath us with its singing, descending note. And in its wake, like an echo that shouldn't have been possible, the laughter rose. Everyone heard it. I watched their faces. Dana closed her eyes. Marcus lifted his chin sharply, like a dog catching a scent. Terry looked at Ellickson. Josie pressed both palms flat against the ice and leaned down. And the laughter continued longer than I'd ever heard it, maybe 20 or 30 seconds of continuous, layered, childlike voices bubbling up from beneath us, not from any single direction, from everywhere beneath the sheet, as if the lake itself were laughing through multiple throats. Then it stopped. The silence after was absolute. Nobody spoke for at least a minute. Then Marcus said, "Jesus Christ," and Ellickson said, "Now you understand why we don't file this." That was the moment. That was the collective agreement. Not explicit, nobody signed anything, nobody made a pact, but in the way Ellickson said it, and in the way nobody disagreed, we all crossed a line together. We became people who knew something and chose not to report it. And I think each of us had a slightly different reason, and I think none of those reasons were good enough, and I think all of us have carried that inadequacy since. I need to tell you what Ellickson told us afterward, in his truck with the heater running and coffee from a thermos that he passed around. He spoke slowly, without drama, like he was giving a debrief. He said he'd first heard it in 2009, alone, doing exactly what I'd been doing, winter DO monitoring, routine readings. He said he'd reported it to his supervisor at the time, a man named Grady, who'd since retired. Grady had listened carefully, then told Ellickson that a technician in the 80s had reported the same thing on the same lake. That technician had filed a formal incident report. DNR had sent a dive team in spring after ice out. They'd found nothing. No structures on the bottom, no submerged vehicles, no bodies, no source for any sound. Lake bottom was flat silt and decomposing weed matter. Average depth 9 feet. Maximum depth 14 feet at center. Nothing. Grady told Ellickson to stop including it in his field notes. Not maliciously, not as a cover-up. More practically. He said, "There's no action item. It doesn't affect water quality. It doesn't affect fish. It'll eat your time and your credibility. Leave it." Ellickson said he'd left it for 3 years. Then, in 2012, a new hire had heard it and come to him scared. He'd done then what he was doing, now taken a small group out, confirmed it, explained the history, and established an informal understanding. Not a conspiracy, just a recognition that some things don't have a bureaucratic home. I asked how many people in the department knew. Ellickson said, "Current staff, 7, now including you. Over the years, maybe 15 total. Some transfer out, some retire, some quit. Nobody's ever gone public." I asked if anyone had ever tried to investigate further, beyond the dive team. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "Josie has." Everyone looked at Josie. She was a small woman, late 40s, with weathered skin and eyes that always seemed slightly narrowed against a wind that wasn't there. She hadn't spoken yet. She shifted in her seat and said, without looking at any of us, "I've been recording it for 2 years. I have 14 separate recordings." The silence in the truck was different then. Not the held silence of awe, but the uncomfortable silence of people realizing they're in deeper than they thought. Josie said, "It's not ice acoustics. I've run spectral analysis. The frequency profile is consistent with human vocalizations. Specifically, prepubescent vocal ranges, multiple distinct sources, and it's responsive," Marcus said. "Responsive to what?" Josie said. "To us. It's louder when there are more people on the ice. I've measured it alone and with others. Amplitude correlates with surface presence." I felt my skin contract, not from cold, from the specific kind of fear that comes from hearing something you'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. Ellickson said, "That's enough," in a tone that was clearly a boundary. Josie shrugged and looked out the window. We drove back separately. No one suggested lunch or follow-up or further discussion. The group dispersed into the ordinary Saturday of a Minnesota winter errands, gas stations, the fluorescent normalcy of grocery store aisles. I went home to my empty apartment and sat on my mattress and thought about what Josie had said until the light failed and I was sitting in the dark. It's responsive. It correlates with surface presence. Those phrases wouldn't leave. They reframed everything. If the sound was merely geological, a freak acoustic property of that particular lake basin, some resonant frequency of the clay bottom and the ice sheet, then it shouldn't change based on who's standing above it. But if it responded to presence, then it wasn't just sound, it was interaction. I didn't go back to Kasota for my next scheduled reading. I called in a sensor malfunction, said I needed to swap my YSI unit, bought myself 2 weeks. In that time, I did something I'm not proud of, something that violated the implicit trust of the group. I researched the lake independently. The County Historical Society had records going back to the 1860s. Kasota, the name comes from the Dakota Sioux, meaning clear or cleared off. The lake had been part of a larger wetland system before European agricultural drainage. No settlements directly on its shores ever. No recorded drownings. No missing children in the immediate area I checked. I checked thoroughly. I went through county death records, school enrollment data, newspaper archives from the Mankato Free Press going back to 1900. Nothing. No tragedy that would give the laughter a narrative, a source, a reason. That absence disturbed me more than a drowning would have. A drowning would have been an answer. Terrible but contained. What I had instead was a phenomenon with no etiology. Sound that behaved like communication, came from a place where no one was, and had been doing so for at least 40 years that anyone could document, and probably much longer, given the Dakota name and the fact that the lake was cleared off before white settlement. Cleared off. I kept thinking about that phrase. What does it mean to clear off a lake? Clear it of what? I broke down and called Josie. It was a Tuesday night, around 9. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting. "I knew you'd call," she said. "You're the type." I asked what type that was. "The type who can't leave a hole unfilled. Ellickson, he's a guardian. He manages it. Dana doesn't think about it between visits. Marcus pretends it didn't happen. You'll pick at it." I said I wanted to hear her recordings. She said, "Come to my place Thursday. Bring headphones." Josie lived in a farmhouse outside St. Peter, alone since her husband left in 2019. She had a home office with acoustic treatment on the walls, foam panels, the kind you see in recording studios. On her desk were 2 monitors showing waveform analysis software, a shelf of hard drives, a professional-grade hydrophone still in its case. She poured us both whiskey without asking and sat me down with a pair of studio-quality headphones. Then she played the recordings in chronological order. The first few were faint, barely distinguishable from background noise if you didn't know what you were listening for. Ice sounds, water sounds, the deep subsonic throb of a frozen lake under pressure. But threading through it, like voices in another room, the laughter, thin, musical, sourceless. As the recordings progressed chronologically, the sound grew clearer. Not because Josie's equipment improved, she told me she'd used the same hydrophone throughout, but because the phenomenon itself seemed to be intensifying. By her most recent recordings, from just 3 weeks prior, the laughter was unmistakable, full-throated, joyful, a chorus of children in what sounded like a state of absolute delight. And then she played me the one that changed everything. "This is from January 30th, she said. "The day before you all came out with Elixon." She hit play. I heard the now familiar underwater ambiance, the laughter building in its usual way. But at the 2-minute mark, the laughter stopped abruptly. A silence of about 5 seconds. Then a single voice. A child's voice, clear as glass, speaking in a tone that was not laughing. It was calling. It said a name. It said my name. I tore the headphones off. Josie was watching me with an expression of terrible sympathy. "Yeah," she said. "It said mine too. 3rd recording, March 2023. That's when I knew it wasn't just sound." I asked her what she thought it was. She said, "I think it's a mouth." I didn't understand. She said, "I think the lake is a mouth, and I think the laughter is a tongue. I think it tastes us when we're above it, and I think it's been learning how to call us by name because it's getting hungry enough to try." I left Josie's house at 11 that night and drove home through empty county roads with my high beams cutting through nothing. The fields were white and featureless on both sides. The sky was black and starless. I drove exactly the speed limit, and I did not turn on the radio because I was afraid of what might be on it. I need to stop here and say something about what was happening to me psychologically, because I know how this sounds. I know the shape of this narrative. A man hears something strange, becomes obsessed, spirals. I know that shape because I've been an addict. Alcohol was my version of the same architecture, a signal that seems to come from outside you, that seems to be calling specifically to you, that feels like it requires your attendance. I recognize the pull for what it was. I recognize that Josie was deep in it, that she'd built her life around it the way I'd built mine around bottles. The foam-treated office, the shelf of hard drives, the years of documentation. That wasn't research, that was devotion, and I recognized that I was in danger of the same thing, not because the laughter was supernatural, I still didn't know what it was, but because it was offering me what I most wanted and couldn't admit: significance. A reason to pay attention to my life, something that needed me to witness it. So I made a decision. I called my sponsor. Yes, I was in recovery, 2 years sober by that point, and I told him everything. Not about the lake specifically. I told him I'd encountered something in my work that was pulling at me the way drinking used to, that it was making me feel chosen, that I wanted to pursue it, and the wanting felt familiar in a bad way. He said, "Then don't." He said, "You know what the next right thing is. You don't need me to tell you." The next right thing was to stop, to not go back, to do my job, file the winter kill flag, recommend aeration intervention for the lake, and let someone else take the readings if I couldn't do them without picking at the wound. The next right thing was the mundane and difficult act of not following fascination into obsession. I did the next right thing for 3 weeks. I reassigned Kasota to Dana, citing personal scheduling conflicts. I did my other lakes. I focused on data. I went to meetings. I called my sponsor. I slept badly, but I slept. And every day, the memory of my name in a child's voice from beneath black water grew less vivid, less urgent, more like something I could have imagined. Then Josie called me. It was a Thursday, late February. She said, "I need you to come to the lake with me tonight." I said no. She said, "I'm going, whether you come or not, but I'm going to auger a hole and put my hand in the water, and I want someone there in case I can't pull it back out." I should have called Elixon. I should have called someone with authority, someone who could have stopped her. But I understood in the way that addicts understand each other, that nothing I said would change her trajectory. She was past the event horizon. The only choice I had was whether she'd be alone. I said, I'm not going on the ice. She said, fine, stay on shore. Just be there. I drove to Kasota at 10 that night. The temperature was -8. No moon. The lake was a flat absence in the landscape. You could only tell it was there because the stars stopped reflecting off the ground at its edge. Josie's truck was already there, engine off. She was suiting up by her tailgate, headlamp on, auger assembled. I stayed by my truck. I'd promised myself that. Shore only. She looked at me across the parking area and nodded once. Then she walked out onto the ice, pulling her sled behind her. The sound of her boots faded. Her headlamp bobbed and shrank until it was just a point of white light, maybe 200 yards out. I could barely see her. I heard the auger start. That distinctive grinding whine as it bit into the ice. It ran for about 30 seconds, then stopped. Silence. Her headlamp was stationary. She was crouched down, presumably clearing ice chips from the hole. Then I heard the laughter. From shore, at that distance, I shouldn't have been able to hear it. But I heard it. Not faint, not muffled. Clear and present and enormous, as if the entire surface of the lake were a speaker membrane vibrating with the force of 100 children laughing in chorus. It filled the basin. It echoed off the far tree line. It was everywhere. Josie's headlamp didn't move. The laughter continued. It rose in pitch, in intensity, in layered complexity. I could hear individual voices, now dozens of them, maybe more, each distinct, each expressing its own particular shade of delight. Not unison, not coordinated. The natural cacophony of a playground, of a recess yard, of a summer pool. The sound of children being completely, uncomplicatedly happy. It was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. I took a step towards the ice. I caught myself. My boot was on the transition between the gravel of the boat ramp and the ice edge. I hadn't decided to step forward. My body had done it without me. The way your hand reaches for a glass before your mind has agreed to drink. I stepped back. I gripped the side mirror of my truck and held it. Josie's headlamp moved. It was coming back, fast. She was walking quickly, almost running back toward shore. The laughter was still going, impossibly loud, and I could hear something else now underneath it. A deeper sound. A resonance so low it wasn't sound so much as pressure. A vibration in my sternum, my sinuses, the liquid of my eyes, like standing next to a church organ's lowest pipe. She came off the ice gasping. Her headlamp blinded me, and I threw up my hand. She grabbed my arm with both hands. Her gloves were off. Her fingers were bare, and I could see in the amber spill of her headlamp that her right hand was bright red. Vascular red. The red of flesh that has been submerged in water, cold enough to cause damage. I put it in, she said. I put my hand in the water. Are you okay? Something touched me. She wasn't panicking. That was what scared me most. Her voice was level, almost clinical, but her eyes were wrong. Wide in a way that wasn't fear. Wide in a way that was wonder. Something touched me, she said again. Small fingers, a child's hand. It held my fingers the way a toddler holds your hand, gentle, and then it pulled, just slightly, just a suggestion. I looked at her hand. The skin was an angry mottled red from cold exposure, but there was something else, faint marks around her wrist. Not bruises exactly, more like the ghost of a grip. 4 small ovals where fingers might have pressed, too small for an adult hand. We're leaving, I said. She didn't argue. She let me guide her to her truck. I turned on her engine, her heater. I sat with her while her hand warmed and the red faded, and the marks I checked, the marks didn't fade. They remained. Pale pink ovals, a child's handprint in negative. The laughter had stopped the moment she came off the ice. The silence was complete. Even the wind had died. I said, "You can't go back." She said, "I know." But she was looking past me, toward the lake, and her expression was not fear. It was longing. The specific, devastating longing of someone who has been offered something they need and has been forced to refuse it. I followed her home that night, made sure she went inside, drove back to my apartment at 1 a.m. through the frozen landscape, and sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes because I couldn't stand the thought of my empty apartment. The walls, the silence, a silence that was just silence and nothing more. 3 days later, Josie didn't come to the weekly data upload. No one could reach her by phone. Dana drove to her house and found it empty. Truck gone, some of her monitoring equipment gone, hard drives gone. Ellickson drove to Kasota. Her truck was at the access point, engine off, cold. It had been there long enough for snow to accumulate on the hood. Her auger was on the ice, about 200 yards out, lying on its side near an open hole. Her headlamp was beside it, battery dead. Her gloves were folded neatly on the sled. No footprints led away from the hole in any direction. But it hadn't snowed since Monday, and wind could explain that. It could explain a lot. They found her car keys in the truck, her phone on the passenger seat. The hard drives were in the back seat. All of them. The county sheriff's department investigated. The official report said probable drowning a technician working alone on the ice, possible equipment accident, fell through the hole she'd augured. The hole was regulation 8-inch diameter. A person cannot fall through an 8-inch hole. Nobody said this to the sheriff. The ice around the hole was intact, uncracked, 28 inches thick. There was no way in except the hole, and the hole was too small. Nobody said this either. Her body was never recovered. They sent divers after ice out in April, 14 feet of water at maximum depth, flat silt bottom, decomposing vegetation. No body, no equipment, no sign anyone had ever been beneath the surface. I am 31 years old now, 4 years sober. I transferred to a desk position at the district office 6 weeks after Josie disappeared. I process data. I calibrate equipment for others. I don't go on the ice. The recordings exist. I have copies. Josie's hard drives were returned to the department after the investigation concluded, and I copied them before they were archived. I don't listen to them. They sit on a drive in my desk drawer. Knowing they're there is enough. Knowing they prove I'm not insane, that this happened, that the sound was real, that's enough. I don't need to hear it again. I don't need to hear my name. But I need to tell you what happened last week, because it's why I'm writing this. I was at a gas station in North Mankato. It was evening, maybe 6 o'clock. Late March. Still cold, but the days were longer. The light angled differently. Spring was a suggestion. I was filling my tank, and across the pump island, there was a woman I didn't recognize with 2 children in her back seat. A boy and a girl, maybe 4 and 6. They were playing some game, slapping each other's hands, the kind of pointless, joyful, repetitive game that children play when they're bored and happy simultaneously. And they were laughing. I heard the laughter, and my hands stopped moving on the pump handle. It was the same timbre, the same layered, breathless, delighted quality, the same sound I'd heard beneath 27 inches of ice on a January morning in the dark. Identical, not similar, identical. As if whatever was beneath that lake had been sampling real children's laughter, or producing something so precisely calibrated to the frequency of joy that the real thing and the copy were indistinguishable. Or, and this is the thought that won't let me sleep, as if real children's laughter had always been the thing I was hearing, as if the lake wasn't copying anything, as if what lives beneath the ice and what plays in back seats and schoolyards and summer pools is the same substance, the same signal, emerging from the same source through different surfaces. I looked at those children and I felt something ancient and wordless, not fear, not suspicion, but a dissonance, a sense that the sound coming from their mouths was older than them, older than the species that made them, that laughter itself was not ours, that it passed through us the way radio passes through an antenna. We give it shape, we don't give it origin. I finished filling my tank. I drove home. I sat in my apartment and listened to the upstairs neighbor's television murmur through the ceiling, and I thought about Josie's hand in black water and the small fingers that held hers and the gentleness of the pull. There's a meeting tonight, my regular AA group, in the church basement on Walnut. Fluorescent lights and bad coffee and folding chairs. I'll go. I'll sit with other people who understand that the thing calling to you doesn't need to be a substance, that it can be a sound, that it can be a place, that it can be the promise of being held by something that knows your name. I won't talk about the lake. I'll talk about one day at a time. I'll talk about the gratitude of ordinary things. I'll mean it. But when I walk to my truck afterward, in the dark, in the cold, when the quiet of the parking lot settles around me, I'll listen. I can't help it. I listen everywhere now. In grocery stores, in waiting rooms, in parks. Whenever I hear children laughing, I listen beneath it. For the depth, for the resonance, for the thing that sounds like joy, but has weight to it, has age, has intent. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes I hear it. That layer beneath the laughter, that subsonic pull, that low, patient tone, like the lake is everywhere now, like it was never just Kasota, like every frozen surface is a lid and every warm surface is a door, and the only difference is whether the mouth beneath is open or closed. Josie said the lake was a mouth. She said the laughter was a tongue. I think she was almost right, but I think she had the scale wrong. I don't think it's one lake. I don't think it's one mouth. I think it's one throat, and everything is its surface. And sometimes in the cold, in the dark, in the silence between one sound and the next, you can hear it swallowing. I haven't had a drink in 4 years. I go to work, I process data, I attend meetings, I call my sponsor. I do not go on the ice, but I want to. God help me, I want to. Not because I'm suicidal, not because I'm chasing something, because the laughter is so beautiful, because whatever held Josie's hand held it gently, because the pull was just a suggestion, because the worst thing about that sound isn't that it frightens me. The worst thing is that it sounds like being welcomed home, and I have never, not once in my life, felt that anywhere else. I'll go to my meeting tonight and I'll do the next right thing. I'll come home to my apartment with nothing on the walls. I'll sleep. I'll wake up. I'll do it again. But the ice forms again in November, and each year, the pull to take readings on Kasota personally, to reassign it back to myself, to walk out to center in the dark with an auger and a question grows stronger by exactly the amount that my resistance grows weaker. I know what the next right thing is. I'm just not sure how many more times I can do it. Last night I dreamed I was standing in the center of the lake, and the ice was clear, perfectly transparent, like glass, and I could see through it to the bottom. And the bottom was not silt. The bottom was children. Hundreds of them, packed close together, looking up at me through 9 feet of dark water. Their mouths were open. They were laughing, and their eyes were not children's eyes. They were older than that. They were older than anything. And one of them had Josie's face. She was smiling. She was holding her hand up toward the ice, palm open, fingers spread. The way you'd press your hand to glass to greet someone on the other side. I woke with my own hand raised above me in the dark, reaching for a ceiling I couldn't see. The next right thing, one day at a time. November is 7 months away.